Welcome back to the London Futurists podcast. Can we use AI to improve how we handle conflict, or even to end the worst conflicts that are happening all around us? That's the subject of the new book of our guest in this episode, Simon Horton. The book has the bold title, The End of Conflict: How AI Will End War and Help Us Get On Better. Simon has a rich background, including being a stand-up comedian and a trapeze artist, which are perhaps two useful skills for dealing with acute conflict. He has taught negotiation and conflict resolution for 20 years across 25 different countries, where his clients have included the British Army, the Saudi Space Agency, and Goldman Sachs. His previous books include Change Their Minds and The Leader's Guide to Negotiation. Simon, welcome to the London Futurist podcast.
Thank you very much for having me here, David.
Good to see you again, Simon.
Likewise, Callum.
Simon, before we come to talk about AI and the future, what can you tell us about your past? For example, I understand that you grew up in a part of the world that was suffering under a long-standing sectarian conflict. What influence did that have on you?
I grew up in Essex, just outside of London. But what we forget was that in the 1970s and 1980s and even the 1990s, there was a civil war in Britain at the time, specifically the Northern Ireland Troubles. Obviously, the majority of that took place in Northern Ireland. But as a 9-year-old, 10-year-old kid, I thought the majority of it took place in my living room because my mum was Irish Catholic and my dad was English Protestant. And so every time something took place in that civil war, bomb went off or whatever, and it was on the news, and in the 1970s, that was pretty much a daily event, the war would fight out in my living room. My dad would blame my mum would blame my dad. This was very much part of my backdrop as I grew up. I remember at the time, even as that 9-year-old kid, thinking, surely there's a better way. Surely there's a better way that my mum and dad can talk about this topic. Surely there's a better way that different governments involved and the different communities involved can solve that problem in Northern Ireland. It certainly wasn't a conscious decision, but looking back, I am quite confident the reason why I ended up teaching negotiation skills, teaching collaboration, teaching conflict resolution is because of that in my childhood. And I'm pretty sure that that was the unconscious thinking guiding my decisions.
So you grew up with discussions of conflict around you. I mentioned in the beginning that there are conflicts all over the world just now, but in your book you point to a statistical trend highlighted by Steven Pinker and others that actually conflict has been decreasing. What do you think are the causes of this trend, and does AI have a role to play in accelerating that?
Yes. As you say, Steven Pinker's written The Better Angels of Our Nature and Enlightenment Now, both of which chart the decline in violence in pretty much any form and over pretty much any time period that you want to talk about. In the 20th century, there were less wars in the second half of the 20th century compared to the first half. There were less wars in the fourth quarter compared to the third quarter. There have been less wars in the first quarter of this century compared to the fourth quarter of the last century. Obviously, there's a bit of an upwards blip at the moment, which just goes to show that we can't take this for granted. But generally, that's the trend. And it's pretty much any form of violence. For example, violent crime in Britain is down over the last 30 years by 80%. Most people, if you ask them, has it gone up or down over the last 30 years, they'd nearly all say it's gone up. Whereas in actual fact, it's gone down by a huge amount.
Partly because of newspaper coverage, partly because we pay attention to shocking news and we don't pay so much attention to the lack of shocking news.
Exactly that. Hans Rosling, the statistician, gives the example of in 2016, there were 40 million commercial passenger flights around the world, of which 39,999,990 landed safely. 10 did not land safely. All 10 that did not land safely were reported on widely across the world. None of the 39,999,990 that landed safely were reported on. And so we read, there's been a plane crash in Cincinnati. Oh, there's been a plane crash in Dhaka. And we read these and we go, oh my gosh, it's so dangerous to fly in planes or whatever. Because, as you say, our brain is wired for looking out for that danger.
Actually, that's not irrational.
No.
You don't generally learn much from something that succeeds. Where you learn is where something goes wrong. So it is rational to pay attention to the stuff that's going wrong.
Yeah.
But it can lead us astray to good old cognitive bias if we think that we're getting a fair representation of what's going on in the world.
Yeah, exactly that. It's very rational. All of us who are alive right now can be thankful to that process because it has kept us alive. It's just at times it can be overly cautious, and we need to be more conscious of that cognitive bias, as you say. Interestingly, so I interviewed Steven Pinker, and one of the things that he said was that the problem that I was going to have is not just persuading people that AI can help reduce violence, but that violence is in decline in the first place, that these problems are solvable in the first place. People look at the Israel-Palestine situation and such like, and they say, well, that'll never be solved, will it? Murder, well, we'll never stop that, will we? It's just a given kind of thing. But we forget that Israel-Palestine is a tremendously difficult situation at the moment, but Israel-Egypt was an equally difficult situation up until 1978, when, after decades of war, they reached a peace agreement and they became allies ever since. Northern Ireland, we were talking about, that was an equally intractable situation. No one ever thought that the likes of Martin McGuinness and Gerry Adams on one side and the Reverend Ian Paisley on the other side would ever come to an agreement. But they did, and the war ended. Martin McGuinness and Ian Paisley ended up becoming friends. They shared an office and became friends. So wars do end. The good news is that wars tend to end quicker than new wars start, and so the trend is downwards. I do believe there are explanations for that, of which AI is part of that trend, and so I do believe AI can continue that trend.
Before you get onto the AI, there's a very interesting phenomenon. I share your admiration for Steven Pinker's book, Enlightenment Now. I think it's quite brilliant in all respects, except for its chapter on AI, which is strange, to say the least. He has some odd ideas about that. But one thing I find very interesting is not only that people don't know that the world is getting better in the sense of less violent, they actually don't like it when they learn it. Pinker got an enormous amount of flack for pointing out these factual things, because there's something in us that not only wants to make sure we learn from the bad news and pay more attention to the bad news, we don't like it when we're told that things are getting better. And I've never quite understood that.
I agree. And Pinker did get a lot of flack. I think he got flack from two sources. One is academics, and that's just a typical academic kind of thing to do. Partly that was because he was a non-historian entering the world of history, and they didn't really like that. And they didn't really like the fact that he brought figures and maths to it and graphs, because that spoils their stories. But other academics, people like Peter Turchin and such like, have also brought a lot more data to it and a lot more accurate measurements, finding reliable proxies for certain things and then working with those. There is disagreement, but that's just a natural part of the academic process. But I also agree that he gets a lot of flack from the average person. And I get flack when I say, hey, wars are going down. That, oh, no, we like our wars kind of thing. People feel comfortable with that. I don't really know why that is.
I think it's partly because we have a narrative about ourselves that we are a very violent species.
Yes.
I wish I had £1 for every time I've been told we're the most violent species on Earth. Whereas in fact, we're probably the least violent species on Earth.
Yes.
There's no other species which is at least partly carnivorous, which can gather more members together that aren't in its tribe without starting to attack each other. Chimpanzees are all covered in scratches and bites because they're always hitting each other. They're very violent. They don't commit mass murder because they haven't got the weapons to do it. But a little known fact about chimps is that the most exciting thing a male chimp can do, they don't do it very often, is to kill another chimp. And they do it as a pre-planned murder. If you get 5 or 6 chimps out and they spot a chimp from another tribe, they'll go and capture them, hold it down, and rip its heart out. And it's the most exciting thing a chimp can do. We don't tend to do that very much. We do it sometimes, but it's aberrant behavior in humans. It's normal behavior in chimps. But we have this very strong belief that we are incredibly violent, partly because we've got the tools to ravage the world and we're busy doing it. But it's an unfortunate narrative that we have about ourselves because I think it makes us more pessimistic than we should be. We'll be right back after a quick break.
Marketing is a puzzle. You can either give into the confusion or learn to love the solve. On the Axiom's Real Talk About Marketing podcast, guests like Aaron Schaefer of GM share how to manage challenges.
Make sure that you're not fixed in terms of what you're thinking about. The team's going to change, and the way teams operate are going to change. COVID was a great example of that. The industry is going to change. Are cookies going away or not? That was another great example of that. And so, how do you continue to evolve as the space evolves?
Guests from HP, The Trade Desk, and Databricks share thoughts on today's marketing landscape. Find Real Talk About Marketing on YouTube, Axiom.com, or wherever you hear podcasts.
I think part of the narrative is also that there is a fear that elites and comfortable people who are not in the midst of a war zone might be too complacent, that they're not sensitive enough to the terrible things that are happening in Sudan and Gaza and Ukraine. And so in order to actually convince people, we need to be able to argue that the methods we're talking about, supplemented by AI perhaps, can actually make a difference to these war zones as well, rather than saying, well, it's not that big on the grand scale of things. I think that reaction may well rub people up the wrong way.
Yeah. Our superpower is our collaboration. What makes humans different is our ability to collaborate on the scale that we can. In fact, collaboration is the most important and most powerful Darwinian force. Everybody thinks it's competition, and obviously competition does exist. But how do we win the competition is through collaboration. The other species that are similarly collaborative are species like ants. There's probably more ant biomass in the world than there is on any other species. But collaboration is the great Darwinian force, and that's what we do.
That's a very interesting point, and it echoes Yuval Harari's observation that we collaborate because we all collectively agree to believe in things that aren't true, like monarchy and money and God. Why is it that you've got collaboration going on in species which have got very low levels of intelligence, ants, and in species, us, where you've got very high levels of intelligence, and it's happened because we've got this complicated, sophisticated language ability that no other species has got, and that's enabled us to collaborate in ways that they can't. Why the gap in the middle? I guess there's two ways to collaborate. One can be done by dumb animals and one can be done by relatively smart animals.
Well, I think there's collaboration all the way through, actually. I don't think there's a gap. For example, life itself is collaboration. The very earliest forms of life, even prior to cells, is collaboration between systems of chemicals that reproduce. They don't believe that it began with a single self-reproducing chemical that then kind of evolved and took over. They think it started with self-reproducing systems of chemicals. Then when we get the cell, which is probably the great evolutionary breakthrough, that's collaboration. That was mitochondria working with other cells, other forms of bacteria.
Was that collaboration or was that capture? I thought that what happened was one cell swallowed another one and turned it into a mitochondria. I suspect the mitochondria didn't like it very much.
Well, except for mitochondria exist, don't they? They still exist.
They're our slaves. They're the slaves of the eukaryotic cell.
I think people talk about it as a symbiosis. Both benefit from this.
Yes.
Slavers always say that.
Then you've got the multicellular animal, which is, again, the next big breakthrough, and that is collaboration. So I believe that there's collaboration all the way through.
And there's hunting animals as well, packs of dogs and wolves.
Yes.
Yeah.
So where does AI come into collaboration? Is AI going to make it easier for us to collaborate, to learn from best practice and to help us to follow best practice? Or will AI instead spread division and competition and tribalism?
So it is that idea of spreading best practice that you mentioned. that pretty much any advance in information technology or general purpose technologies does lead to some degree of progress, whether we're talking about DNA as an early form of information technology, or whether we're talking about language, symbolic reasoning, which was that thing that made that advance in collaboration to a greater degree of collaboration than other animals can do. And then when we have writing, this is when civilization really starts to spread. And then the printing press was a major breakthrough in terms of progress. Even a lot of the academics who disagree with Steven Pinker about the timelines of decline in violence, they pretty much all do agree that since the printing press, in the modern period, violence has declined. This is generally because, whether we're talking about writing, language, the printing press or whatever, it enables us to collate best practice ideas, spread those best practice ideas further. It enables us to critique them, to add to them, and so on. Each of them has led to advances in terms of civilization. The printing press led to the Enlightenment, it led to the scientific revolution, the industrial revolution, political revolutions, the end of the divine right of kings and being replaced by some kind of democracy, all because best practice ideas were able to spread further. I believe AI is going to do the same. One of the superpowers that AI has is that it can model human best practice and then spread that further. And there are many examples of this, like radiologists. The best radiologists will train the AI to look at the scan for tumors. The AI learns how to do that and then can do it better, and then make that capability more widely available to places that don't have the best radiologists available to them. It's the same with conflict resolution. Humans, as a species, know how to resolve conflict. And we just have to look at Northern Ireland, we have to look at South Africa, Colombia, these kinds of places to see that we do know how to resolve conflict. But that best practice isn't widely spread. And even when it is widely spread, human frailties like the ego, like the amygdala, like emotions, prevent us from using the best practice when we find ourselves in the situation. I teach negotiation skills and conflict resolutions, and I still find myself getting angry and in an argument. I can't help it. But AI doesn't have an amygdala, it doesn't have an ego, it doesn't have an emotion. So it can model best practice, spread that knowledge further, and be a part of the process in a neutral kind of way without being triggered by its amygdala or its ego or its emotions. For example, as a really, really simple, basic example, let's say you are having an argument with your partner, and it's the standard argument that you've had all of these years. It's the same argument, maybe slightly different words, but it's the same argument. And maybe you just think, I've had enough of this argument and I'm too tired today. Let's ask ChatGPT. And you ask ChatGPT. And ChatGPT will actually give you pretty good advice in terms of that situation. Maybe you've got an argument with your noisy neighbor who's playing bagpipes at 2:00 every morning or whatever. How do you stop that? Well, ask ChatGPT. It will give you some good advice around holding that conversation. So let's say it's with your partner. You ask ChatGPT, ChatGPT gives you advice, and then you run it past your partner, and the partner says, yeah, that sounds reasonable. It's great. You've just solved a problem. Maybe a week later, the argument arises again, and you both look at each other and think, last time we tried ChatGPT and it worked, didn't it? Shall we try ChatGPT again? And we do. And again, it gives good advice. So you go, And then after 3 or 4 times of this, you start to firstly get the hang of it, and it's solved not just the recurring problem that you always have, but other ones. And then you start to realize that you no longer need to ask ChatGPT because you've worked out what it's doing and the frameworks. And in the same way that ChatGPT learned from us humans, we individually will learn back from ChatGPT. Then we'll go off to the office or go out and meet our friends or whatever, and maybe there's another argument situation there, but we'll bring that best practice that we've just learned from ChatGPT to that situation as well, to that context. Plus, maybe they will have gone through the same process with their partner. And so they'll start bringing this best practice. And so the best practice starts to spread deeper and deeper. And as AI becomes more and more embedded in our infrastructure, quietly in the background, it will be operating by best practice. For example, two self-driving cars both see a parking space. If it was humans, there'd be a race to get that parking space. They won't do that. One of them will just wink at the other one with its indicator in a you take it kind of way, because it's seen another one just around the corner. All of this will be happening in the background. Humans will just start to pick up on this. How do we get behavioral change? How do we get cultural transformation in terms of behaviors or beliefs? It's one person at a time in a viral kind of way. If you're nice to me when I meet you, when I go off and meet somebody else, I'll probably be nicer to them. If you're angry with me and you shout at me, well, if I go off and meet somebody else, I'll probably be more angry and more likely to shout at them. And so this is how behavior spread through society. And this is how culture change.
This sounds very compelling and attractive, but do you have any evidence that something like this can work?
Yeah, I'd like to build on that because I think that is a good question. A couple of things. One is there'd be a generational effect because lots of research shows that young people are using large language models throughout their lives. They've weaved it right through their lives. So you would expect Gen Z to be having less rows than Gen Y, Gen X, and Boomers did at the equivalent times in their lives. Is there any evidence of that? Also, different people adopt large language models at different rates. So you'd have some people getting really quite good at being emotionally intelligent, or whatever term we want to give it, whereas other people are just sticking with old habits. Is there any evidence of that happening?
It is very early in the day for getting this kind of evidence in a real-world situation for the particular process that we're talking about. There is plenty of other evidence for AI resolving conflict, which I'll get onto. But the quality of ChatGPT's advice in terms of negotiation and conflict resolution has really only been good enough in the last year, perhaps only in the last 6 months or so. So it's early days for there being sufficient evidence gathered in that respect. I agree with you in terms of that kind of native user effect as we go through. In terms of academic experiments and studies, there's lots of studies around collaboration and prisoner's dilemma kind of experiments, very well studied construct. They have set up experiments where they have people in a do people collaborate or not kind of context. If they have a plant in that situation, somebody part of the research team who acts more collaboratively, then everybody else will be more collaborative. Now, what's interesting is that that is also the case if that human is replaced by a bot. So if a negotiation bot is part of this experiment and that negotiation bot acts more collaboratively, people will be more collaborative. And it's also interesting that even if people know that it is a bot, they might think it's a human or they might know it's a bot. Either way, they end up going more collaboratively. So in other words, AI can be the exemplar of best practice that humans learn from. That's all academic. Have they done studies yet in terms of real-world effect? No, not yet, because I think it's too early. Is AI being used in a practitioner kind of way in terms of conflict resolution? Yes, absolutely. There are many, many examples. It's being used in many, many different ways.
And your book covers some of them?
Yes, absolutely. The example that I like most of all, it was the example actually that was one of the very first people who I interviewed for the book. When he told me his story, that was when I realized this was going to be a big story. This is a chap called Colin Irwin. He was a research fellow at Liverpool University. He does what he calls peace polling. He was involved in Northern Ireland in the Good Friday Agreement. His job there was to walk down the high street with a clipboard, and his team would stop people as they were shopping, and he would ask them, what did they want to see in the peace agreement? And then he would also collect their demographics, and then he'd feed that back to the negotiators. And the negotiators would see, okay, the Catholics would accept this, but they wouldn't accept this. And the Protestants would accept this, and they wouldn't accept this. I think we can see where the solution is going to be. And then he would then go back to the streets for the next issue and so on. And in doing that, they were able to draw up an agreement that they were exceedingly confident would be supported by the people. And then when it was put to a referendum, it had a very, very high majority. Now, contrast that with the Oslo Accord, which was taking place around about the same time in the Israel-Palestine situation, which unfortunately failed, despite the fact that a potentially very good agreement was reached within the room that all the negotiators were happy with. The problem was it was done in secret because it was illegal for any negotiator on either side to be allowed to talk to the other side. Basically, the Norwegians said, hey, come on, we can sort this out. So it was all done completely in secret, which meant that the communities weren't involved in it. And so when it was announced, it just didn't have any support. What this chap, Colin Owen, does now, he does exactly the same around the world in different conflict zones, but he uses an AI platform to support his process. It's a platform called Remesh. It effectively collects opinions on different topics, but it can do it at scale, 1,000 people at a time. It can do it in real time, and it can do it in a facilitated process that leads to a nuanced agreement across the majority of people, even in a very divided situation. The example he gave was in Libya. And in Libya in 2020, after their civil war ended, and we can say ended, but often it's just a pause in these situations. And you can imagine it was pretty chaotic. Lots of different tribal gangs, warlords, all kind of different agendas involved. What he did is he went through this process in real time, in a 2-hour process, with 1,000 people, each inputting what they would like to see for a government of national unity. And it was done live on television with 1/3 of the country's population watching it. And nobody expected that a government of national unity would be formed. But after going through this process, in a couple of hours, they were able to generate the set of principles of what the government of national unity would look like. It's still in place. It still exists, completely against expectations. I'm not saying that right now we're at a place where AI is powerful enough, like a magic wand, to say, right, we're going to end the Ukraine-Russia war. We're going to end Israel-Palestine war. We're not there yet at all. But what AI is doing right now is many, many small things that are helping, and they're going to develop. And that Libya example is, for me, the closest to a live war that has been ended thanks to the efforts of AI.
We'll be right back after a quick break.
Should I be excited or afraid of AI? The answer is yes. It's both.
Things are going to look so different in the next couple years. You will not be ready for the disruptions that are going to come.
I'm Jeff Nielsen, host of Digital Disruption, the go-to podcast for technology leaders. Our generation's conflict, I think, is going to be emotional, not economic.
The companies that are going to win are the ones that have a couple of characteristics.
Stay ahead of the curve with Digital Disruption. Available now on your favorite podcast platform.
So I can see evidence for what you suggest, Simon, that when people have good models of collaboration, good models of emotional intelligence, this can lead them in that direction themselves. But what we're seeing a lot online is exactly the opposite. We're seeing Fox News, we're seeing newspapers in the UK and elsewhere, we're seeing radio shock jocks that are deliberately exaggerating tensions and oversimplifying things and blaming the nasty group over there for all the problems. So rather than greater emotional intelligence, it seems to be worse emotional intelligence. And AI sometimes seems to be stirring that up as well, because AI is able to suggest the right kind of stinging barb to actually break people out of their collaborative, friendly spirit and push them into a nasty mode instead. Tell me more about how the positive side of AI is going to come to the fore against these other tendencies.
AI is not a single homogeneous thing. It is multifaceted. Lots of different models can be used in lots of different ways. The big trend in polarization and division that has happened in recent years AI has had an input into that, without doubt. A lot of it has come from social media, and social media using AI algorithms to optimize for engagement. That typically relies on outrage and such like. The more outrage there is, more people pile into the conversation, the more anger, and it just becomes a self-fulfilling thing. The social media platforms are happy because everybody's on their platforms. In the meantime, the world has become more and more dangerous and more polarized because of these reasons. So AI can, if used in the wrong way, accelerate conflict. The platforms that we're talking about here, for example, Remesh, that we just mentioned, the Colin Owen used in Libya, and other platforms like Polis and other similar platforms, they work in a different way. They use the AI to optimize for agreement. Let's say it's a policy conversation like, should there be more cycle lanes in London or less cycle lanes in London? I'm a cyclist, so I'd type in, there should be more cycle lanes in London. If I did that on Twitter or X or any other similar kind of social media platform, instantly 1 million people would jump on me. I'd burst into tears and never go near the platform ever again. On Remesh and Polis, you can't do that. All you can do is agree to it, disagree with it, or ignore it. And then you can type in your own sentence. So let's say you don't like cyclists. I've typed in my sentence that there should be more cycle lanes in London. And maybe you think that's a really bad idea. Well, you can't flame me or shout at me, but you can disagree with it. Fine. So you disagree with it. And then maybe you type in your sentence, I think there should be less cycle lanes in London. And then I can agree with that or disagree with it or whatever.
Sorry, Simon, I'm not clear on this. How is that not giving people the ability to flame? Is it that you don't make a comment on the other person's remark, you just make a statement elsewhere?
It's not on a thread.
There's no threads, okay.
Yes, exactly.
Which means, all right, so you get rid of the arguments, but also you make the whole thing a lot less interesting, surely.
Well, bear with me, Callum. So I put in my opinion. David's disagreed with me, so he's put in his opinion. Callum, you put in your own opinion. And we have 1,000 people or more all putting in their opinions. And then the platform starts to analyze this, starts to collate it, and then starts to build a visual map of different clusters. So there's a group here that all seem to have this kind of set of beliefs grouped together. And there's another group over here. And then what tends to happen is that somebody thinks, I think I can come up with a sentence that the majority of this group will support. And the majority of this other group will also support. So they'll type that in there. And perhaps they do, perhaps they don't. But even if they do, let's say they do come up with a majority on both sides, somebody else will go, actually, I think I can come up with an even better statement. So it becomes almost gamified for agreement. And whether that's seeded and steered by the facilitator, or whether it's just the dynamics within the group, but it starts to move towards a solution that the majority of people on either side can support, then what tends to happen is that once an agreement is reached, even the minority that voted against it still support it because they support the process that led to it. They recognize that this was a fair process, that they were part of, they were listened to, they were heard, but they're a minority, so they'll accept the majority vote.
And you're saying this has evidence of working with Polis in Taiwan or Remesh in Libya and so on?
Exactly. V-Taiwan, Virtual Taiwan, is the kind of poster child of this. Virtual Taiwan is a government department in Taiwan where basically they send them the difficult debates, the divisive debates, and pretty much anything digital. And it's been used many, many times and finds solutions for quite divisive topics. It's not just Taiwan. It's been used literally thousands, low thousands, but still thousands.
In the UK?
Yes, it's used in the UK. So, for example, the think tank Demos, they've got a program called Waves, which is working with Remesh. They're in the process of doing a couple of pilots. Camden Council with, I think, Staffordshire Council, they're in rollout. But they're saying that if they haven't done 20 or 30 councils in the next year, they will have failed.
Is this very different from Reddit, where comments get upvoted and downvoted and the most popular comments get much more visibility? Was there a need to invent a new platform? Could Reddit not have been used for this?
Perhaps it is similar kind of technology, but Reddit isn't used for voting ultimately, is it? Also, perhaps the issue with Reddit is that there is still the thread aspect. As you follow down the thread, you do see lots of sarcastic comments and such like.
They're the best bits.
Well, maybe. That's you doing it, isn't it, Callum?
No, I'm not responsible for all of them, honest.
Callum, you need a virtual AI to sit on your shoulder and we all do. We all do, don't we?
Yeah, we do.
I've got you, David.
That is another way. For example, the social media platform Nextdoor does have that. It does have an AI bot checking your inputs and saying, are you sure you want to word it this way?
Yeah. I'm very attracted by the idea that AI can help us all become better negotiators, become better interlocutors with each other. I use GPT for myself for that very purpose, and I can see it works really well. And I think that could have a very positive effect. On the other hand, AI and other technologies, but particularly AI, are introducing massive amounts of change into our societies, and change is uncomfortable. There's always losers from change, and even the people who don't lose, they're often made uncomfortable by it. And I'm pretty convinced that that is where the current wave of populism, both left-wing populism, particularly right-wing populism, have come from. So you've got AI producing these two contradictory effects. It shows us a better way to talk to each other, but it also introduces massive amounts of change. And we know from way, way back, Alvin Toffler and before, that change is very uncomfortable and makes people cross. And people are certainly cross.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
So which wins, the positive or the negative?
Well, that's down to us. But you're absolutely right for flagging that up. I agree. I think the current disruption has come from the rapid change we've gone through in recent decades. That change is only going to accelerate. And I think we're about to go through not just one change, but waves of change that we as a society are not ready for. We as individuals are not ready for. I think society needs to have exactly that kind of conversation about how collectively do we deal with it and how individually do we deal with it. So which wins? It is down to us. Does the pro-peace dynamic of AI win or the pro-conflict side of AI win? That's down to us. And that's exactly why I think we should be having these conversations to highlight the different options.
So my final question would be more on these lines. What should each of us be doing if we care about that outcome? You say it's down to all of us. So what should we do?
We should be part of the conversation. There is a tendency to hide from AI because it's such a big, scary thing. So firstly, we should educate ourselves and find out what is the current situation, what are the different options moving forward. We should try and view AI not as a binary, it's bad, it's good kind of thing, but as a nuanced thing with multifacets to it. And some of those might be good, some of those might be bad. How might we avoid the bad? How might we generate the good? People should read my book, of course, and they should spread the word that the positive side of AI is there and the danger side of AI is there so that more people can make the correct decision. We should be using ChatGPT, I think, in this context. I think we should ask ChatGPT because quite simply, not enough of us know the best practice in a conflict situation. ChatGPT does, so it's there, so use it.
Just ChatGPT, or are there other alternatives available that you would point people to as well?
Absolutely. Claude, different LLMs are good. And of course, on my own website, theendofconflict.ai, there is a little web chat icon on there on the bottom right-hand corner. Click on that and ask it any negotiation or conflict resolution question that you've got, and it will give you a good advice. Now, obviously, I have to make the caveat that if it's a legal situation, this is not legal advice. Do get a lawyer, but there are many sources of good advice that we can get from using AI.
I think that's a very good message to end on, that we can all use large language models to improve our emotional intelligence. So, Simon, thank you very much indeed for joining us on the London Futurists podcast.
My pleasure. Really enjoyed talking with you.
Thank you very much.